The night was reluctant to leave. Paris, usually restless, lay in an uneasy, frost-bitten quiet. Smoke from distant fires lingered over the city like a bruised memory. The Seine flowed silently, reflecting a moon that seemed hesitant to rise. Somewhere, far away from the courtiers and the salons of Versailles, the city's heartbeat thumped in darkness. The streets were slick with mud, littered with scraps of bread and the detritus of desperation. And in the Conciergerie, the once grand prison of kings and queens, Marie Antoinette waited, not as a queen, not as a princess of Austria, not as the woman who once danced through gilded halls with elegance measured in minutes of admiration. She waited as a shadow, a silhouette of what had been, bound by rope, stripped of color and shorn of hair. At dawn on October 16th, 1793, the guards arrived. The light had begun to creep across the stone floors, tentative and gray, as if even the sun feared the violence that would unfold. Marie looked at them with eyes that had already learned every shade of human cruelty. They did not bow, they did not speak. They stood like statues carved from bureaucratic indifference, and in their presence the air felt heavier. Her wrists were tied so tightly that the rope had dug into her skin until it burned, marking her with invisible scars that would outlast her flesh. Her hair had been hacked off days earlier, leaving her head bare, uneven, and defiant. In a different time, she might have wept, but centuries of privilege, grief, and the slow erosion of dignity had taught her something no crown ever could. The human spirit, even when battered, refuses to vanish entirely. Most history books end here, at the guillotine. Most teachers pause and call it a tragic but necessary revolution. But the truth is far darker. Her execution was not the punishment. It was merely the punctuation mark. The real sentence, the one that tore at her soul, began months earlier. They didn't just want her head. They wanted her humanity, her identity, her memory, and her children. They wanted to dismantle her like a clockwork automaton and see if a queen could still tick without her crown, her dignity, her family. And through all of it, Marie survived. She survived with a dignity sharper than any blade, more enduring than stone. Marie Antoinette had been born a princess in 1555 in the gilded corridors of the Habsburg Empire. Vienna had raised her on protocol, embroidery, and whispered lessons about the fragile alliances of Europe. Her childhood was a constant performance, a lesson in observation and subtlety. Every step was measured. Every glance was noted, every word weighed. At 15, she was sent to Paris, promised to a dauphin she had never met. The marriage was political, a union of dynasties, a transaction of power. Paris received her with suspicion and gossip. The court whispered about her foreignness, her accent, her youth. Yet Marie learned quickly. She learned to navigate intrigue, to smile when hatred was aimed at her, to dance when envy struck like a dagger. She became a mother in 1778, giving birth to Marie Theresa. Her second child, Louis Joseph, followed soon after, and then in 1785, a son, Louis Charles. These children were her private triumphs, her small victories against the cold machinery of politics. They were her world, and they were what the revolution would take first.
To understand her imprisonment, we must first understand the revolution's cruelty. It was not brutal because of swords or bullets. It was brutal because it was systematic, deliberate, and emotionally surgical. The night of August 2nd, 1793, began quietly. Paris slept under a suffocating darkness. The streets emptied of witnesses. The air still except for the distant bark of dogs and the occasional stumble of drunken citizens. Inside the temple prison, Marie Antoinette rested, exhausted from months of fear and heartbreak. Her son, Louis Charles, slept near her, blissfully unaware of the danger. He was 8 years old, innocent, harmless, perfect. The revolutionaries did not see children. They saw symbols, threats, weapons. And so, at midnight, they burst into the room. Torches hissed, doors slammed, boots pounded like the pulse of a city gone mad. Marie's first instinct was maternal. She threw herself over her son, trying to shield him, to convince herself that proximity might prevent the inevitable. But the men were efficient in their inefficiency. Messy, chaotic, human enough to trip over chairs, shout contradictory orders, and yet relentless in their mission. Marie's next instinct was human. She screamed. The sound bounced off the stone walls, reverberating like the toll of a bell that would never toll again for innocence. She felt the child ripped from her arms, felt her own ribs burn from the effort to cling, felt the floor bite her knees as she collapsed in helpless fury. This was the revolution at its peak. Organized chaos with a cruel moral logic that valued symbolism over humanity. For Marie, the lesson was clear. France had taken her child first, her dignity second, and would reach for the rest in due course. When the last echoes of her son's cries faded into the Parisian night, Marie Antoinette was moved to the Conciergerie. Picture the coldest, dampest, most unforgiving stone cell you can imagine. Now add centuries of despair, the remnants of rats, the unwashed walls of those who came before. This was not a prison. It was a slow, mechanical death, designed not to kill the body immediately, but to erode the soul. 2 guards were assigned to her. They did not speak. They did not protect. They observed. Every gesture, every blink, every whisper became part of an invisible record of compliance or defiance. Privacy was non-existent. Sleep was a memory. Food was a transaction. Hope was a crime. In this silence, in the dripping, dank cold, she learned a cruel new reality. Human beings can be destroyed without a single blade. The mind can be carved up, shredded, and left to bleed long before the body sees harm. Even here, the revolution could not reach everything. Marie held on to small relics of her children, secret, fragile, defiant. A miniature portrait of Louis Charles, a lock of his hair, hidden deep in her corset. When the guards searched, when the state tried to confiscate every piece of her identity, she clutched these items like driftwood in a stormy sea. They were tiny, immovable acts of rebellion, proof that the human spirit resists total annihilation. Even in stone, in cold, in humiliation, she was still a mother. The days bled into weeks. Hours became indistinguishable. The drip from the ceiling was a metronome of despair. The walls whispered, the guards blinked, the candle flickered. And Marie thought, not about revenge, not about escape, not about power. She thought about her children. She thought about the fragments of her past. She thought about what it meant to be human when stripped of everything. And in this quiet, in this unending, suffocating silence, she began to sharpen a weapon no revolution could seize: her dignity, her calm, her capacity to endure. Even if the guillotine awaited, she had already begun to prepare a performance far beyond its reach. The night was alive with quiet malice. The air had a certain thickness, a tension that carried the weight of things unspoken. In the temple prison, Marie Antoinette slept fitfully, her dreams heavy with fragments of the past, her children laughing in sunlight, Versailles gardens alive with color, music echoing off golden walls. But dreams, in 1793, were fragile. The door burst open without warning. Boots thundered across the floor, torches flaring against the stone walls, casting flickering shadows that danced like demons. A dozen men swarmed the room, some tripping over chairs, some colliding mid-step, their voices raised in chaotic commands that overlapped until it became impossible to distinguish one word from another. Louis Charles awoke screaming. The sound tore through the quiet like a blade through silk. His mother was there instantly, thrown into a frantic embrace that could not withstand the collective force of revolutionary zeal. Marie clutched him, pressed herself over his small body, whispered promises she knew were powerless, her heart hammering in her chest like a war drum. The revolutionaries were merciless in their chaos. Orders were barked, then contradicted. One man fell over, knocking a torch to the floor. Another yelled a correction only to be ignored. The room became a theater of absurdity and terror, a tragicomic ballet choreographed by desperation and ideology. Somewhere in the confusion, the guards tore the child from his mother's arms. His tiny body was flung into their midst, his screams blending with Marie's, creating a soundtrack of grief that would echo in her memory forever. For a moment, the men hesitated, not because they felt compassion, but because the raw, unfiltered sound of maternal despair pierced even their hardened revolutionary armor. And then, the doors slammed. Silence fell like a guillotine shadow, heavy and absolute. Marie collapsed against the stone floor, trembling, her hands clawing at empty air. The night, which had been thick with fear, now held only loss. Her child was gone. The journey to the Conciergerie was cruelly ironic. Marie Antoinette, once transported in gilded carriages with silk curtains and polished horses, now traveled in a wooden cart that had carried manure, criminals, and firewood. The wheels creaked under her weight, protesting against their new, delicate cargo. The streets were lined with Parisians, their faces eager, expectant. Some cheered, some hurled stale bread, some stood in silent curiosity. Marie's eyes swept over the crowd, seeing familiar faces twisted with hatred or excitement. She felt the wind on her cheeks, cold and biting, her shorn hair standing in awkward tufts. She did not flinch. Inside her, a storm raged. Outside, the city erupted with a mockery of celebration. The contrast was brutal. The world alive with noise, her own world reduced to a tight coil of grief, shame, and endurance.
The Conciergerie was a mausoleum disguised as a prison. Its walls oozed dampness, its floors were slick, and every echo was amplified, carrying footsteps and whispered threats into the furthest corners. Marie's cell was a space designed to erase identity. No comfort, no warmth, no privacy. A single candle flickered dimly, throwing shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the stone. 2 guards were assigned to watch her. They did not interact, did not speak. Their presence was constant, oppressive, mechanical. Every move she made was observed. Every blink was recorded in the unspoken ledger of her confinement. The guards were not human companions. They were instruments of surveillance. The original CCTV, relentless and silent. Meals were delivered cold, tasteless, and insufficient. Sleep was impossible. The stone floor sapped the body of warmth. The drip of water from the ceiling became a relentless rhythm that measured time not in hours, but in suffering. Privacy was a myth. Every act, washing, dressing, moving, was an exhibition, a small degradation repeated endlessly. Yet Marie discovered small acts of resistance. Hidden in the folds of her corset, she carried a miniature portrait of her son, Louis Charles, and a lock of his hair. These relics were her anchor to humanity, her secret defiance against the system designed to erase her. Each time she touched them, the faintest spark of hope ignited within her. Even the revolution could not steal her memories, her love, or her quiet rebellion. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Marie Antoinette became a ghost in stone, moving through a world where time had no meaning and hope was measured in stolen moments with a portrait or a curl of hair. She learned to survive in silence, to endure constant observation, and to withstand the crushing weight of psychological torture. The guards' presence was a paradoxical torment. They were silent, yet every breath they drew reminded her of the impossibility of privacy. Their eyes followed her movements, their hands occasionally rifled through her sparse belongings. Every act of small autonomy, folding a blanket, touching her hair, even blinking freely, became an act of courage. Marie's isolation was punctuated by fragments of news, whispered rumors, and the occasional overheard conversation. She learned of her son's forced confessions before anyone dared speak them directly to her. Each revelation cut like a knife, slicing through maternal instinct and leaving scars deeper than any physical injury. Yet in this mental siege she retained a sliver of defiance. The portrait, the lock of hair, and her own inner voice became weapons of survival. Even when the revolution sought to obliterate her identity, she nurtured the last vestiges of herself, the person who loved her children and remembered how to be human. The guards were not cruel in theatrical ways. Their cruelty was banal and systemic. They were instruments of routine, following orders without thought, occasionally displaying awkward hesitation when confronted with the raw reality of their task. Marie observed them as carefully as they observed her. She noticed their patterns, their weaknesses, their moments of distraction. She learned to move around them, to speak minimally, to use silence as a shield. The art of surviving became her primary occupation. At times she feigned compliance so absolute that it disarmed them. At other times, she clung to her small relics with trembling hands, feeling the warmth of memory and love against the cold efficiency of oppression. These moments became lifelines, brief illuminations in the darkness of her cell. The revolutionaries were masters of emotional destruction. Louis Charles was being weaponized, forced to testify against his mother in a way that no child could possibly understand. Every whispered word she overheard, every fragment of his coerced confession became a dagger to her heart. Marie did not scream, she did not collapse, she did not beg. She learned to stop. Stop eating, stop sleeping, stop speaking unless necessary. This was not surrender, it was a survival strategy, a withdrawal into the last fortress of her mind. Even grief ran out of words. Yet in this silence, her mind remained active. She remembered courtly etiquette, the whispered lessons of her youth, the beauty of her children's faces, the cadence of her husband's voice. These memories were her armor, the last remaining threads connecting her to the world before betrayal and violence. Marie's ordeal revealed a cruel paradox. The more the revolution sought to strip her of identity, the more her inner life solidified. The Conciergerie designed to break her instead became a crucible forging resilience. Her mind became a sanctuary. Her heart, though wounded, remained a source of quiet power. She began to meditate on her role, not as queen, not as prisoner, but as mother. This perspective allowed her to endure what should have been unbearable. She could no longer protect her children physically, but she could preserve their memory, their essence, within her. In this act, she discovered a form of rebellion that could not be seized: love, memory, and dignity in the face of relentless erasure. Months passed, each day a near mirror of the last, until the inevitable approached. The Revolutionary Tribunal was waiting, a grotesque theater of justice where guilt was irrelevant and spectacle paramount. Marie would soon face the courtroom where the performance of her death would be orchestrated by men and women who viewed morality as optional and cruelty as entertainment. The Conciergerie had stripped her body, privacy, and hope, but it had not broken her mind. It had not extinguished the love she held for her children. It had not stolen the grace with which she would meet the end of her life. Even in the shadow of a guillotine yet unseen, Marie Antoinette's story continued, a story of endurance, resilience, and the quiet defiance of a woman determined to hold on to what even a revolution could not conquer: her heart.
The day of the trial arrived like a storm over Paris. Dark,
turbulent, inevitable. Outside, the streets hummed with expectation. Inside, the revolutionary tribunal waited, a grotesque theater of power, where truth had been replaced by accusation and justice by spectacle. Marie Antoinette was brought forward, pale, bound at the wrists, her hair shorn unevenly, her white dress coarse and shapeless. Every step she took echoed off the stone corridors, a hollow sound that seemed to mark the finality of her journey from queen to accused. The courthouse itself was a contradiction, a space meant for deliberation, transformed into a stage for collective judgment. High above, the judges sat like indifferent gods, their expressions carefully cultivated masks of boredom, authority, and self-importance. The audience below, packed like sardines in the hall, had come not for justice, but for entertainment. This was 18th century reality TV, complete with shouting, cheering, and moral outrage performed as a spectacle. The line between outrage and amusement blurred, and Marie Antoinette, seated alone before the tribunal, became both villain and victim in the same breath. Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, the chief prosecutor, entered the room with theatrical precision, a man whose enthusiasm for performance rivaled his dedication to justice, or what passed for it. His voice carried over the crowd as he read accusations from a stack of papers, each one a grim testament to revolutionary creativity. Treason, allegedly collaborating with foreign powers. Financial corruption, bankrupting France by habit alone. Moral decay, spreading vice wherever her footsteps fell. And the accusation that would shock even the hardened, incest with her own son. The courtroom reacted predictably. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some horrified, some skeptical, some eager to witness history's most scandalous claim. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of sweat, bread, and fear mixing into a pungent perfume of chaos. Marie Antoinette did not flinch. Her eyes, weary from months of confinement, scanned the room, not the judges, not the prosecutors, but the faces of the women who had marched for bread, the mothers who had lost sons, the silent spectators who sought some flicker of truth amid the circus. Witnesses were brought in one by one, each offering testimony that was as contradictory as it was sensational. Half the statements could not possibly be true. The other half defied even the most basic laws of physics. Some witnesses described events Marie could not recall, while others accused her of crimes she had never committed. The audience drank it in with the enthusiasm of fans of a sports match, cheering and booing on cue, oblivious to logic. The courtroom became a theater of absurdity, whispers of gossip elevated to evidence, rumor codified as fact, and emotion trumping truth. Marie listened, silent, unmoving, her body a sculpture of grace under fire. She did not argue. She did not protest. She understood, as did any who had survived long confinement, that words were weapons wielded by the loudest, not the most just.
Then came the accusation that would linger through history, the one meant to pierce her spirit: incest. The crowd, accustomed to spectacle, froze. Even the judges, masters of composure, blinked. For a moment, the air seemed to shift. Marie did not gasp. She did not faint. She did not plead. Instead, she addressed the women in the audience, the mothers, the market women, the citizens who had once demanded her presence at Versailles. Her voice, calm but cutting, carried the weight of truth. I appeal to all mothers here. The simplicity of the statement was devastating. No defense, no argument, just a mother reaching across ideology and fear, touching the hearts of those who understood love more than law. Some women wept,
Some whispered. Even a few hardened revolutionaries looked down, unsettled by the raw humanity they had been trained to ignore. In that instant, Marie Antoinette was no longer queen, no longer accused, no longer symbol. She was simply a mother confronting a lie. But the spectacle could not be interrupted. The crowd, accustomed to spectacle, erupted once more, cheering, booing, and hurling insults. The trial was a performance where morality was optional and cruelty mandatory. Every accusation, every contradiction, every cheer became a weight pressing upon Marie's soul. Yet she sat unmoving, her posture erect, her gaze steady. The contrast was stark, the theater of chaos around her and the quiet, unshakable dignity within her. It was a battle of wills, and though she could not alter the verdict, she could reclaim the small sovereignty of her comportment. Every second she remained calm, composed, and human. She resisted the revolution's effort to dehumanize her completely. The judges, frustrated by her composure, resorted to theatrics. Papers were slammed, voices raised, threats issued. But Marie Antoinette remained a study in restraint. Every shout, every gesture of aggression only highlighted the absurdity of their authority. The audience's reaction was carefully choreographed, but spontaneous in its cruelty. Some laughed at the absurdity of accusations, others jeered at the humanity of her suffering. Bread was thrown at the courtroom walls, a symbolic act of revolt turned mockery. Marie endured. Her hands were bound, her dress coarse and rough, her hair a jagged reminder of imprisonment. Yet she did not shrink, did not bend, did not cry. Her dignity remained intact, a silent rebuke to the chaos surrounding her. Even as false witnesses contradicted themselves, even as accusations escalated in cruelty, she maintained composure. Every forced confession from her son, every rumor about her supposed crimes could not touch the strength she drew from memory, from love, from survival. In the courtroom's theater of cruelty, Marie's mind became her sanctuary. She retreated into memories of her children, her family, her life before the revolution. She clung to the relics she had hidden, a portrait, a lock of hair, moments of intimacy and humanity that no tribunal could confiscate. These small items were acts of defiance, fragments of identity and maternal love preserved against the tide of hatred. Each heartbeat, each controlled breath, became a quiet rebellion. She had lost her freedom, her child, and her reputation, but she could not lose her inner self. The verdict was inevitable. In a system where guilt was assumed, justice irrelevant, and spectacle paramount, Marie Antoinette was condemned. The audience erupted in triumph, celebrating a symbolic death before the real one. Marie remained composed, serene even. She did not plead, she did not argue. She understood that the revolution had taken her life in stages, first her freedom, then her child, then her dignity. The tribunal's final act was merely a last formal gesture in a process already complete. The weight of the sentence was nothing new. The psychological torment of months had already prepared her. She had endured isolation, humiliation, and grief beyond measure. This final decree was another step in the sequence, anticipated and absorbed with quiet fortitude. After the trial, Marie was returned to the Conciergerie, the walls of which now felt even more oppressive. She walked the damp halls, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, each sound a reminder of the inexorability of time. She requested paper, not for plea, not for negotiation, not for revenge. She wrote to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, pouring out love, forgiveness, and final counsel. The letter was tender, raw, a last connection to the life she had known. It was confiscated immediately, another act of cruelty layered atop the months of torment. Marie's expression remained calm. Her hands trembled only slightly as she folded the paper and set it aside, the message preserved in her heart, even as the physical letter was stolen. The night before her death was spent in silence, broken only by the occasional clatter of guards or the whisper of wind against stone. Marie rested her head on the wooden table, clutching her relics close. The Conciergerie had been a crucible, but it had not extinguished her inner life. Dawn would come with the cart, the crowd, and the guillotine. But in these hours she remained sovereign of her spirit. She had endured every form of cruelty the revolution could muster, and now, even as the end approached, she retained the dignity, grace, and quiet defiance that would outlast the spectacle of her death.
The night was heavy over Paris, the kind of darkness that seems to press against stone walls and suffocate breath. Within the Conciergerie, silence reigned, a silence so absolute that even the faintest creak of a floorboard felt deafening. Marie Antoinette, seated at the small wooden table in her cell, stared into the dim candlelight. Its flame flickered like a living thing, as if hesitant to illuminate the final hours of a life it had witnessed. Her hands, bound at the wrists, rested atop the table. Clutched close were the last tangible pieces of her son, the miniature portrait and the lock of hair she had managed to preserve through months of isolation, interrogation, and psychological torment. These relics were more than mementos. They were defiance, reminders that though the revolution could take her body, it could not erase her love, her memory, her very self. Outside, the city slumbered fitfully. Paris, oblivious to the quiet dignity of one of its former queens, slept through plots, paranoia, and the whispered footsteps of guards moving between dark corridors. The Seine murmured like an indifferent witness, carrying secrets and rumors downstream, none of them about mercy. The guards, ever present and ever observant, watched as Marie wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. Her hand trembled only slightly as she inscribed words of love, forgiveness, and maternal guidance. There was no plea for clemency, no demand for justice. In her writing, she transcended fear, transforming grief into clarity and compassion. The letter was immediately confiscated, a bureaucratic cruelty to match the personal agony she had endured. Marie did not cry. She did not scream. She merely folded her hands, breathing slowly, as though the act of writing and losing the letter had cleansed her spirit rather than destroyed it. She ate sparingly, almost nothing, for the body had little use for sustenance when the mind was already preparing for the end. Sleep came fitfully, a brief nodding in the corner of a damp, shadow-filled cell. Even rest was uncomfortable, for the walls themselves seemed to hum with the anticipation of dawn. At last, the moment arrived. The guards entered her cell with all the warmth and consideration of a drizzle-soaked stone. "It is time," they said casually, as though announcing a change in the weather, rather than the imminent execution of a woman who had once ruled France. Marie rose slowly. She did not falter, though the rope around her wrists bit cruelly into her skin. Her eyes, bright but steady, scanned the room once last. Each stone, each shadow, each whisper of air seemed to carry memories of months spent in isolation, months spent stripped of dignity, months in which she had been forced to endure the theft of her child, the intrusion of constant surveillance, the humiliation of guards observing every movement. Her dress, a coarse, white penitential garment, hung loosely from her shoulders. Her hair, cut unevenly and roughly, framed her face in jagged, rebellious tufts. She adjusted her posture, standing as tall as the ropes would allow, embodying calm, composure, and unbroken resolve. The wooden cart awaited outside, its wheels caked with mud, its planks worn and creaking from years of labor. It was not a chariot befitting a queen, not a carriage of elegance or ceremony. No, it was a vehicle designed for criminals, vegetables, manure, and, on this morning, the deposed Queen of France. Marie ascended the cart with careful, deliberate movements. The guards assisted minimally, their hands professional but detached, treating her as a task rather than a person. She did not speak,
though her eyes briefly closed as if in silent prayer, not for herself, but for her children and the fragments of love that still remained in her heart.
The streets of Paris were alive with expectation. Thousands of citizens lined the route, shouting, jeering, and hurling insults. Bread, thrown as a symbol of anger and hunger, bounced off her coarse dress. Chunks of stale loaves splattered along the cart's surface, a surreal combination of comedic slapstick and historical horror. Yet Marie remained composed. Her gaze was steady, her body unshaken. Even the insults and projectiles could not reach the inner sanctum of her dignity. The cart moved slowly, jostling over uneven cobblestones. Each lurch threatened to throw her off balance, but she adapted, shifting her weight with subtle precision. The coarse dress fluttered around her ankles, her jagged hair catching in the morning wind like the last flickers of a fading crown. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts, children perched on shoulders, craning their necks to see. Adults shouted, gesturing wildly, some recording the spectacle with crude sketches or written notes. The city had transformed into a theater of political theater, each spectator a performer in a collective act of humiliation. Yet Marie Antoinette, stripped of status, stripped of privacy, stripped almost entirely of identity, walked through the scene with a calm almost supernatural. Each step was a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a counterpoint to the chaos orchestrated by the revolutionaries. At last, the Place de la Révolution came into view. The guillotine loomed above the square like an unyielding monument, its gleaming blade catching the first pale light of dawn. Vendors shouted, citizens pressed forward, and the collective murmur of anticipation swelled into a cacophony. Marie descended from the cart with careful grace, her bound hands forcing her movements into deliberate control. She did not stumble, did not falter. The crowd, eager for spectacle, leaned in as she approached the scaffold, but instead of panic, rage, or desperation, they saw composure, serenity, and the quiet command of a woman facing the finality of her life. The steps to the scaffold creaked beneath her feet. Each plank was a reminder of mortality, of inevitability, yet she climbed steadily, unshaken. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, approached, his own demeanor a blend of professional detachment and human discomfort. "Step forward," he said quietly, offering guidance not out of compassion, but routine. Marie's foot brushed his in passing, and with a voice soft yet audible, she said, "Monsieur, forgive me. I did not do it on purpose." Even in the final moment, she offered courtesy. Even in the presence of a man whose job was to remove her life, she maintained a moral integrity that outlasted the cruelty surrounding her. The straps were fastened around her body with clinical precision, her neck placed into the groove polished by countless executions before her. The coarse white dress hung loosely, her hacked hair exposed her face completely, and the wind whispered coldly across her cheeks. Silence descended over the square. Thousands of people watched, but suddenly the din of the crowd seemed to recede. The blindingly bright morning sun reflected off the metal, catching the guillotine's blade in a sinister gleam. Marie inhaled slowly, deliberately, closing her eyes for the briefest instant. Her thoughts were not of fear, they were of her children, of the love she had been denied the chance to continue, of the fragments of life she had preserved against impossible odds. In this final moment, the inner life of Marie Antoinette became a shield against the spectacle, a private sanctuary no crowd could penetrate. Sanson lifted the mechanism. A single metallic note rang out as the blade fell. It was a clean, sharp descent. Marie Antoinette did not scream. She did not struggle. She did not break. Even in the instant of death, her dignity endured, outlasted the blade, the jeers, and the cruelty of the crowd. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in triumphant celebration, shouting, "Long live the Republic!" as though volume could erase the grace they had witnessed. Vendors continued selling chestnuts. Children perched on shoulders, craning their necks to see. Adults shouted, gesturing wildly, some recording the spectacle with crude sketches or written notes. The city had transformed into a theater of political theater, each spectator a performer in a collective act of humiliation. Her body was removed from the scaffold, her head briefly displayed to confirm her identity. The cart that had transported her now carried her lifeless form away. The city, already turning its attention to bread, politics, and gossip, had little time to mourn. But the memory of Marie Antoinette's composure lingered. Artists sketched, writers recorded, and the fragments of her final moments, the apology to the executioner, the calm ascent to the scaffold, the dignity maintained in the face of death, became legend. Even the revolutionaries, in their obsession with spectacle, could not entirely erase her presence. Though her life had been taken, the quiet strength she exhibited ensured that the story of Marie Antoinette endured long after the echoes of the guillotine faded.
The streets of Paris quieted. The guillotine stood empty, its blade reflecting only the gray sky and the shadows of a city that had moved on too quickly. For a moment, it seemed the revolution had won everything. Titles, crowns, privileges, gone. But victory is rarely complete. Marie Antoinette was gone, her body gone, her voice silenced. Yet in the fragments she left behind, the portrait, the curl of her son's hair, the letters written in a trembling hand, her presence endured. The memory of her composure, her courage, and her humanity persisted like embers in the cold air, faint but unextinguishable. History would remember her in pieces, as a queen, a mother, a symbol, a cautionary tale. But for those who looked closer, past the spectacle, past the rumors, past the propaganda, she remained a woman who had faced the unthinkable with dignity and love. She had been stripped of everything but herself, and in that, she was invincible. And as the Seine flowed silently beneath the bridges of Paris, carrying the city's whispers, her story continued, not in the roar of mobs or the headlines of revolution, but in the quiet, enduring truth that even when the world seeks to erase us, the human spirit remains. Marie Antoinette's life ended at dawn on October 16, 1793, but her story, her courage, and her dignity would echo through the centuries, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, grace can survive.